Gross. Willkommen in einem aufregendes video. Welcome to another exciting video. This is case episode 5 of my organisational series of videos. In this video I wish to cover the French army between 1804 and 1807. Unlike my other videos, there is no way I could create a single video covering the entire French army, and even this slice is a major undertaking. I created these videos initially to assist me in my efforts in creating an army list, but the bulk of the video is a historical analysis of the TO&E of the French army between the years of 1805 and 1807. Creating army lists for generic games is a constant issue. Using historical force mixes from specific battles works well, but this video is an attempt to understand the basic organisational structure of a nation's army, looking for ways we could use that data to create army lists, as well as help us understand how a nation's military developed during the Napoleonic Wars. One method you could use to create army lists is to understand the entire army of a nation in a period and try and create army lists from this complete data set. There are many issues with this, and it's something I generally avoided in the past, but I noticed that the Garde du Corps rules makes an attempt in this direction. This shows the Garde du Corps data for the French army. The key values to consider here is the first number, which represents the number of units, which should be regiments, and the last number, which represents the number of figures. Each figure represents 60 men within the unit. Initially this got me quite excited, but then I realised it was filled with what I thought were errors. I'll not cover the details of the errors, and these are detailed in my Prussian and Austrian videos, but it made me realise that in order to do this job properly, the amount of work is astronomical. While I feel the Garde du Corps rules does a magnificent job, it cannot be 100% correct. I've made a number of corrections, and this shows the current state of my corrected data, but my research is not complete, and as a result this is not complete in turn. For example, there are 89 line regiments in 1805, not what's shown in the Garde du Corps lists. The other issue is this data is designed to support a set of rules at a specific scale for a set of rules which is trying to create a fun game. A lot of fudging is required in order to allow players to field a nice range of figures. The main error was depicting the number of regiments correctly but giving it the strength of battalions. As an example, we see the French have 50 regiments of line infantry. This is not correct, and the number should be closer to 90, with a margin of some kind of error. I have not yet fully corrected all the values, but for the moment let's assume it's 50. Each regiment contains 24 figures, or 6 elements, at a scale of 60 to 1, so you quickly discover that in terms of elements, the overwhelming bulk of elements should be line infantry elements, with only a token number of other infantry or even cavalry. This is not the case when you look at the Garde du Corps army lists. Players would not be pleased at discovering most of their nice cavalry cannot be deployed, and instead they need to mainly deploy boring old line infantry. Even the guards become a token force. By decreasing the number of line infantry elements, each player can now field other troops in greater numbers. This is a game mechanic symptom, and my starting point, rather than trying to satisfy the requirement of gamers, is to identify the actual historical facts. I can deal with rules and troop mixes later, but right now let's determine what the correct ratios are supposed to be. A lot of the source material I use in this video comes from the Excellent Napoleon Armies by Ray Johnson. Another source I extensively use is the Excellent Armies of the Napoleonic Era by Otto von Pifka. This shows the English cover on the right. I do not possess this book, but I must admit it looks like a very interesting reference document, which I will certainly consider purchasing. I found it on Scribe, which is a site I have minimal experience with. A quick caveat. The video that you're watching now is an overview of the topic and is not an in-depth, historically detailed analysis. I'm sure others possess superior knowledge and experience in this topic, but for those who wish a layman's analysis, then this is the video for you. As is my normal practice, before we get into the details of the TO&E of the French army, I'll first provide a brief overview of the different troop types that the French employed, as I'll be describing units based on these troop types. The Old Guards were the elite troops of the French army. The main focus seems to be experience rather than the actual size of the soldier, as would be the case, for example, the Grenadiers. But I assume some companies would consist of really large guys. In many ways, the Old Guard were unique, as they represented both elite and veteran qualities. While you could argue elements of the Russian Guard in 1813-14 could also be considered both elite and veteran, most guards in most armies would not be classed exactly in this manner, unless of course they experienced a reasonable amount of campaigning. The Guard Velites, which later became the Middle Guard, were guard quality troops, but which lacked the experience of, let's say, the Old Guard. The Old Guards were elite veterans. The Guard Velites were just elite, still pretty good. Being a veteran means you've seen it all and are more experienced in the practical aspects of warfare. Being a guard means you have high morale and willingness to do things other formations would be unwilling to do. Both have their pluses and negatives. In 1806, the Guard Velites became the Middle Guard and were dramatically expanded. I did experience a bit of a surprise when I did my research. What were Marines doing in the Guards? These were Marines which were classed as guards. Some rules give these troops excellent combat abilities, but with poor skirmishing capabilities. I'm uncertain if this is accurate, but this is yet another type of guard, and yes, I did find them in the orders of battles of at least one major battle, very far away from the ocean. The French extracted the best troops from regiments involved in garrison activities and placed them into a single formation at Austerlitz. The order of battle calls them grenadiers, which may or may not be correct, as the number of actual grenadiers would have been far too low to fill out these formations, but then I could be wrong. My guess is these represent all the elite or best troops from the 9 to 10 regiments performing garrison duties. I would expect these troops would be better than the average line infantry and were used in the same manner as grenadiers. The French paid for a number of Swiss regiments which served in the French army between 1805 and 1807. Many rules classed them as veteran. The backbone of the French army was its line infantry. Part of each battalion consisted of grenadiers, skirmishers, and the bulk were fusiliers. The French battalion adopted the combined arms approach, so rather than extract the grenadier companies and form converged grenadier battalions, they left them in the battalions and they normally, I would assume, led the charge when they were charging. This gave the French line infantry an attacking capability that the Austrians, and in some cases the Prussians, actually lacked. It could also explain why the French had such a focus on guards. Sometimes you need a full battalion of big elite guys. The French line infantry were made up of smaller men and trained as light infantry, as well as being able to act as line infantry. Later in the war, this distinction was almost gone. But in 1805 to 1807, these were the equivalent of Grens or Prussian fusiliers. While they lacked grenadiers, they did have an equivalent type. I'm uncertain if this grenadier equivalent company, at least in each battalion, was mainly focused on melee or continued with a fire combat focus. The French line infantry is a bit of a mystery, at least based on the sources I use. The French Navy was not going anywhere after Trafalgar, so the French formed a number of marine battalions from their marines. The Reserve and National Guards are not really covered in my TO&E, but the French did have a large number of National Guards used to garrison the mother country. The Carabinieri were a heavy cavalry which lacked a cuirass. However, after 1809 they began to wear a cuirass and were effectively the same as cuirassiers. The cuirassiers were the other type of French heavy cavalry and were made up of large men on large horses. They were supposed to wear a cuirass. The dragoons were medium cavalry, classed as heavy by some in some sources. The horses were still larger, and the men used a straight sword designed to thrust forward. They were also equipped with a carbine, which could, in theory, fire from their saddle, but for the most part they were used in the same manner as the cuirassiers. The French dragoons did occasionally fight on foot. In 1813 there was at least one dismounted French dragoon formation, but this was due to a lack of horses rather than the desire to fight on foot. The chasseurs à cheval were the standard French light cavalry. They had small but fast and mobile horses, were armed with a sabre that was designed to fight other cavalry from the side rather than to their front, but they could still fight to their front. The hussars were light cavalry, and of all the light cavalry had the reputation of being party animals in pretty much all nationalities. They had small but fast and mobile horses, were equipped with a sabre that was designed to fight other cavalry from the side rather than specifically the forward. They were very effective in exploiting any breakthroughs and riding down fleeing enemy infantry. The lancers were, surprise surprise, lance-armed light cavalry, which could fulfill the same functions as hussars, but also had a very good anti-cavalry capability in the form of their lance. The poor man's shock cavalry in many ways. Using a lance was not easy to do effectively, particularly against cavalry. A lot easier against infantry, but against cavalry took a lot of skill, so they were always very experienced soldiers. During the periods 1805 to 1807, the French engaged in two major campaigns, the 1805 and then the 1806 to 1807 campaigns. There were some changes between these two periods, and they will be raised, but the 1805 structure could also apply to the French army prior to 1805. When Britain declared war on France in 1803, Napoleon assembled an army close to the French-English Channel, hoping to invade England. This never occurred, but while he was there, he instigated a number of reforms and reorganisations. The result was the army which won most of Napoleon's greatest victories up to 1812 had its birthplace this particular deployment. This shows the French regular army in 1805, excluding the Guards. In 1803, the French army had 89 regiments of line infantry, numbered 1 to 112, with obviously some gaps in there. 23 numbers were vacant. The French were supposed to have 156 line infantry regiments in 1805. I'm also uncertain if the number of 156 included the light infantry regiments or not, but that was a total number and not actually the line infantry nomenclature or official nomenclature. In 1803, the French army had 26 regiments of light infantry, numbering 1 to 30. 4 numbers were vacant. Light infantry regiments were raised in departments, or states or provinces, which were primarily mountainous. I suspect the number of 156, which was roughly the number of departments in France, included line, light, and other regiment types, some of which may not have taken into the field or been in the field and thus not counted as part of the field army. The two main regiment types were line and light. Both consisted of 2 battalions, which were normally taken into the field, and a depot battalion. The French mixed troop types in the line infantry battalion, with 1 company being grenadier, 1 being a voltigeur, and the remaining 7 being flissiers. The grenadiers were large men, which led any attack, I assume. The voltigeurs were the skirmishers, and the flissiers were the bulk of the line infantry. The light infantry regiments were organised in a similar manner, except the grenadiers were replaced with carbineros. I'm uncertain if the carbineers were large men or not, but at least they would have consisted of the elite troops. Company size was supposed to be 123 men. However, on average, this rarely rose above 80 men. The Swiss provided 4 regiments until 1811, organised in the same manner as French line infantry. The French heavy and medium cavalry regiment consisted of 4 squadrons of 160 men. As with the infantry, this value was not common, and the squadrons were often only 120 men in size. The light cavalry was also organised into 4 squadron regiments, with the average strength of a squadron being about 120 men. The artillery was organised into 8-gun foot batteries, of which 2 guns were howitzers, and 6-gun horse artillery batteries, with 2 guns also being howitzers. When you look at the actual order of battle, this did vary a great deal, especially in terms of gun types. The Guards experienced the greatest change between 1805 and 1806. In 1805, the French possessed 3 Guard regiments, 1 Grenadier, 1 Chasseur, or Light, and a Marine regiment. These 3 regiments were eventually called Old Guard, although in 1805 each possessed a battalion of Velites, which were elite troops which were not particularly veteran. In 1806, 2 more Guard regiments were raised, 1 Grenadier and 1 Chasseur, and the Velites were removed to form what was to eventually be called the Middle Guard. The Velites battalions were removed from the original Guard regiments and increased in size to form 2 new Guard regiments, 1 Grenadier and 1 Chasseur. These were originally called New Guard, but became the Middle Guard in 1810. Until then, these 2 regiments were still considered as full Guard regiments. The Guard cavalry was even more varied. The Chasseurs de Cheval, light Guard cavalry, consisted of 10 squadrons, one of which was made up of Mamelukes. The Mamelukes were later formed up into an entire regiment. The Garde Grenadier à Cheval, either heavy or medium cavalry, consisted of 8 squadrons. In both cases, the velites may not be in the field army and could be taking the role of depot squadrons. The dragoons originally consisted of a single squadron, but this was raised to 4 by 1807, and this became the Empress Dragoons. The Garde Cheval Léger pour excuse my French, or light Polish regiment, consisted of 4 squadrons, but none were armed with a lance in 1805 to 1807. In 1804, Napoleon formed the corps structure, which was only informally used prior to this. The structure was to serve him well right up to 1815. Each corps consisted of between 1 and 5 infantry divisions, in most cases 2 to 3. There was also a cavalry division, in some rare cases 2 cavalry divisions, and finally a foot artillery and horse artillery regiment, or collection of batteries. The heavy guns were normally kept at corps reserve, and the medium guns being allocated to the various divisions as required. The infantry division consisted of 2 brigades and an artillery battery. When you look at the TONE of various battles, there was often a single brigade consisting of 1 light regiment and 1 to 2 other brigades consisting of 2 line infantry regiments. In each battle, each brigade would have a number of squadrons of light cavalry attached. The cavalry division consisted of a number of cavalry brigades, each consisting of 2 to 3 cavalry regiments. These were normally light cavalry. Most of these formations were farmed out to the infantry brigades, but some remained independent in order to act as reserves. The independent formations would contain a horse artillery battery. The Guard Corps in 1805 is shown here, with the Guard Battalion from Italy included. In this order of battle, the Mamelukes are in a regiment-sized formation, and the Gendarmerie Cavalry Regiment is included. In 1806, the Guard Corps had grown significantly. It's probably the Guards which experienced the greatest change in this period. The Dragoon Brigade consisted of dragoon regiments which lacked horses, thus I assumed were considered as elite foot. The cavalry remained at 4 regiments, although were now organised into brigades. This shows the 1st French Corps in 1805. The light infantry was independent and acted as an advance guard of the corps. Within the infantry divisions, the brigade structure seemed to be rather ad hoc. This was to change in 1806, but in most cases the regiments would form pairs supported by an artillery battery and at least 2 squadrons of light cavalry. The cavalry division consisted of light cavalry. If 6 squadrons were allocated to the infantry, this still left 10 squadrons available for independent action. The artillery formation seemed to consist of 3 batteries. I'm uncertain what the structure was, but 2 foot batteries of 8 guns and a 3rd battery of 8 guns seems reasonable. This shows the 1st Corps in 1806. The 1st Corps was a large corps consisting of 3 infantry divisions. The first point is the more formal uses of brigades, with regiments in the most parts pairing up. The light regiments were in separate brigades, performing light infantry functions. This was to change later in the war, but in 1805 to 1807 the lights were considered as fast infantry. Each division now had an artillery battery permanently attached while in the field. While in 1805 the artillery was generally distributed in this manner anyway, it was not formal and depended on the corps commander. Of course, in peacetime the artillery were always in their own artillery regiments, so I'm only referring to when the corps was in the field. The artillery was mainly 3-pounders, 4-pounders and 6-pounders, although in some rare cases you will find some 12-pounders. The heavier guns, such as 12-pounders, normally remained at the corps level, as did the horse artillery, which normally consisted of light guns, such as 3-pounders in this case. You will notice how non-standard the batteries were. The cavalry now consisted of only a single brigade with 3 regiments. This did vary, but in the whole this was where the light cavalry was positioned, with at least 6 squadrons allocated to the 3 infantry divisions. The final corps was the Cavalry Corps. This shows the Cavalry Corps in 1805. The 1st Division breakdown is not shown here, but was similar to the 2nd Division. This corps contained all the medium and heavy cavalry, in this case 2 cuirassiers and 2 dragoon divisions, with 1 light brigade supporting it. That's 1 light cavalry brigade. The Cuirassier division consisted of 2 brigades, 2 regiments each, in this case only 3 squadrons per regiment. I assume the 4th squadron was left behind as a depot or as a depot formation. You can see the average size of each squadron was about 120 men. A horse artillery battery was also attached. The Dragoon division consisted of 2 to 3 Dragoon brigades, each of which had 2 regiments. No horse artillery was provided as support, although the corps contained batteries which could have been allocated if required. Finally, this corps had a single brigade of light cavalry, as well as corps-level artillery. I assume there was about 6 horse artillery batteries in this artillery reserve. This shows the Cavalry Corps in 1806. The basic structure remained the same, although it was much larger. The only significant change was the Light Cavalry Brigade was expanded to a Light Cavalry Division. For those not interested in actual figure gaming, then the video from this point on uses the data so far collated in creating army lists, so those folks may wish to exit the video now. For those interested in figure gaming, then this section from here on attempts to convert the TO&E into a force mix for a set of figure gaming rules. Converting this into an army list is not a simple matter, and this depends on the scale of rules you're using. For example, at 50 men per figure, you could field a force of 10,000 men. This represents 50 to 60 elements, each of which consists of 4 infantry or 2 cavalry, with the bulk being infantry. The problem is the corps ranging in size from 15,000 to 30,000, so you could only field part of a corps, perhaps 2 infantry divisions and a cavalry brigade. This means we get a total of 68 elements, a large force mix, but manageable. There is no medium or heavy cavalry, nor is there any guards or heavy artillery. There are only 12 elements of cavalry in total. This is an accurate force mix, but not one which most players would prefer to field. This shows a typical division using WRG scales of 50 to 1 for infantry, 40 to 1 for cavalry, and 2 to 1 for artillery. If we move the scale up to 100 men per figure, we can start to field an entire corps, but we will still lack supporting heavy or medium cavalry as well as guards. To simulate Austerlitz, you'll probably need a scale of 1 in 700, or each infantry element represents 2,800 men, or almost a brigade. At the scale of 1 in 100, it seems to be, that is 1 in 100, that's 100 men per figure. That seems to be a good building block scale to use, which you'll then have to modify accordingly. This shows a typical corps using a scale of 100 to 1 for infantry, 80 to 1 for cavalry, and 8 to 1 for artillery. It's the first corps in 1806. It totals 44 elements and would be a viable force mix for any game. It also begins to give you a more interesting element mix with more cavalry and a variety of artillery. This shows the 1st and 2nd Corps in 1806 using a scale of 201 for infantry, 160 to 1 for cavalry, and 16 to 1 for artillery. Each block of elements represents a division or a brigade for the cavalry. A player could choose a cavalry corps or guards corps for the 2nd Corps. At this scale, variety goes up and the choice for each player increases dramatically. Based on this, a player would need to go to a scale of 1 in 600 to reproduce Austerlitz or Jena. This reduces the size of the infantry division to about 2 to 3 elements each. The ground scale in this case would be 1 in 10,000 and the playing area 3 by 4 foot in order to reproduce the manoeuvring which went on before the battles. Of course, if a player possesses a larger playing area and was prepared to game over several days, then a playing area of 6 feet by 4 feet, ground scale of 1 in 5,000, and an element mix of 100 per side allows you to drop the scale to 1 in 300. That's 300 men per figure. This is a viable game, but it would take 2 days to play, or one incredibly intensive day of gaming. If you continue down this path, you'll need to reduce the battlefield to the area the fighting occurred, with minimal pre-battle manoeuvring allowed. This is viable, but the element count would move up to 200 per side, for example, which would require, optimally, 4 days. Team games could reduce the time to play, which is also a viable path to go down. After doing 3 of these videos, I've come to the conclusion the optimal method of creating army lists is by using the TO&E of a specific battle, or by period, if you want to go down by the period path, and focusing on a corps-sized formation as the basic unit. To get the element count down to a practical level, you would need a scale of 1 in 100 for infantry. That's 100 men per figure, which means 800 men per element, allowing you to build a corps-level army list. Players would scale this up as required to allow them to fight the battle they wish to fight. Marengo, a smaller battle, would require you to scale to 1 in 200, that's 200 men per figure, or 800 men per element. Thus, the army list would represent 2 corps-size formations. Players who wish to use rules which uses a scale of 1 in 50 or 1 in 60, that's 50 or 60 men per figure, would pick the units they wish to field from the corps-sized formation and play away. In summary, I'm uncertain if it's possible to create a useful army list for a set of rules which uses a smaller scale, such as 50 to 1, and simply multiply this as you ramp up the scale if you so desire. I think this can only occur if you start with at least a scale of 100 men per figure and attempt to model a full corps. Each nationality may require more than one corps-size formation, so most armies use advanced guard corps and cavalry corps or equivalents, for example, so some choice or some player choice would be allowed. But what you can see at this low scale, you're not going to get a nice balanced force that reflects, let's say, an entire battle. You are going to get an asymmetrical force mix. A lot of line infantry in the centre. Maybe if you're modelling a guard corps, half your force is guard, etc. And so this concludes episode 5, in this case covering the French army between the years of 1804 and 1807. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.